Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we're covering a story that is genuinely historic. A political earthquake has struck South Asia, and the aftershocks are going to be felt far beyond the Himalayas. Nepal, a nation of 30 million people wedged between the two most populous countries on Earth, has just delivered one of the most stunning election results in modern democratic history.
I'm Maya Clarity, and Alex, I want to set the stage here because the scale of what just happened in Nepal cannot be overstated. A political party that did not exist 4 years ago has just won a landslide parliamentary majority. The Rashtriya Svatantra Party, the National Independent Party, led by a former rapper named Ravi Lamakane, has captured at least 117 of 165 directly elected seats, and is leading in 8 more constituencies. That is a seismic shift in a country where the same political families and parties have traded power for decades.
And Maya, let's be very clear about what this election represents. This is Nepal's first parliamentary vote since the Gen Z protests that swept the country and ousted the entrenched political establishment. Young Nepalis took to the streets, demanded change, and when they got their chance at the ballot box, they delivered a verdict that was unambiguous. The old guard is out. The question now is what comes next, and whether this movement can actually govern.
Before we dive deep into this story, I want our viewers to understand the context. Nepal has been through a monarchy, a Maoist insurgency, a civil war that killed over 17,000 people, a transition to a republic, devastating earthquakes, and decades of political instability marked by corruption and patronage networks that have left the country one of the poorest in Asia. This election is not just about one charismatic leader. It is about an entire generation saying enough is enough.
So let's dig into exactly who Ravi Lamakane is, how he built this movement, and what it means for Nepal, for the region, and frankly, for democratic movements around the world that are watching closely. Stay with us, because this story goes much deeper than the headlines suggest.
Let's start with the man at the center of this political revolution. Ravi Lamakane is not your typical politician, and that is precisely the point. He first gained national prominence not through politics but through media and music. As a rapper, he built a following among young Nepalis. Then he transitioned into investigative journalism and television, hosting a hugely popular show that exposed corruption and held powerful figures accountable. He built credibility with ordinary people by doing what the political class refused to do, which was telling the truth about how badly the system was broken.
And this is a pattern we've seen in other countries, Maya, but rarely with this level of electoral success. Lamakane founded the Rashtriya Svatantra Party, the RSP, just 4 years ago. 4 years. To put that in perspective, the parties he just demolished at the ballot box, the Nepali Congress, the Communist Party of Nepal UML, the Maoist Center, these are organizations with decades of institutional history, vast patronage networks, deep pockets, and entrenched connections to the military, the bureaucracy, and the business elite. And a 4-year-old party led by a former rapper just obliterated them.
According to the results published by Nepal's Election Commission, the RSP had already secured 117 directly elected seats with results still coming in from other constituencies where they held commanding leads. To form a government in Nepal's House of Representatives, you need a majority of the 275 total seats, which includes 110 proportional representation seats allocated based on the national vote share. Given the RSP's dominant performance in the direct elections, they are on track to command a comfortable governing majority, potentially even a supermajority.
Now let's talk about what drove this result, because it wasn't just Lamakane's personal charisma. Nepal has a median age of about 24 years old. This is an extraordinarily young country. And this generation has grown up watching the same political leaders cycle in and out of power, forming and breaking coalitions, enriching themselves and their allies, while the country's infrastructure crumbles, while young people leave in droves for migrant labor jobs in the Gulf states and Malaysia, and while corruption permeates every level of government. The youth protests that preceded this election were not spontaneous. They were the culmination of years of frustration.
And Alex, I think it's critical to examine what those Gen Z protests actually accomplished before this election. The protests forced out the existing government and created the political opening for this vote. Young Nepalis, many of them organizing through social media, took to the streets demanding accountability, transparency, and an end to the dynastic politics that had captured the state. They were met with tear gas and water cannons, but they persisted. And when the political establishment tried to co-opt their movement by reshuffling the same deck of cards, the voters responded by flipping the entire table.
Now here's where my investigative instincts kick in, because we need to ask the harder questions. Ravi Lamakane is not without controversy. He has faced legal challenges, including a case related to a cooperative fraud scandal that entangled several public figures in Nepal. His critics accuse him of populism, of making promises that are impossible to deliver, and of lacking the governing experience needed to run a country facing enormous economic and geopolitical challenges. These are legitimate concerns that deserve scrutiny, and we would be failing as journalists if we didn't raise them.
Absolutely, and this is where the story gets more complex. Nepal sits between China and India, two regional giants who have historically competed for influence in the country. Every Nepali government must navigate this geopolitical tightrope. China has invested heavily in infrastructure projects under its Belt and Road Initiative, while India has deep cultural, economic, and security ties with Nepal, including an open border that allows free movement of people. The incoming RSP government will inherit these competing pressures, and how Lamikane manages the India-China dynamic will be one of the most consequential foreign policy challenges of his tenure.
And let's talk about the economic reality on the ground, because this is what ultimately drives political change. Nepal's economy is heavily dependent on remittances from migrant workers abroad, tourism, and foreign aid. The country has a GDP per capita of roughly $1,300. Unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, is staggering. The brain drain is real, with educated young Nepalis leaving for opportunities in Australia, Europe, and North America. The RSP campaigned on economic transformation, job creation, and ending the corruption that diverts public resources into private pockets. Now they have to deliver.
And the delivery question is enormous, Alex. Winning an election is one thing. Governing is another entirely. The RSP is a young party with limited institutional depth. They will need to staff an entire government apparatus, from cabinet ministers to bureaucratic positions, with people who can actually implement policy. The entrenched civil service, which has operated under the patronage of the old parties for decades, may not be cooperative. The judiciary, the military, the police, these institutions have their own power dynamics and loyalties. A mandate from the people is powerful, but translating that mandate into actual governance requires navigating a deeply embedded system.
This is a point that deserves emphasis. We have seen populist movements around the world win stunning electoral victories only to founder on the rocks of governance. The question is whether the RSP has learned from those examples. Do they have a plan for the civil service? Do they have technocrats ready to step into key economic ministries? Do they have a foreign policy team that can manage the China-India balancing act? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that will determine whether this historic election leads to historic change or historic disappointment.
Let me bring in another dimension that the international media is largely overlooking. Nepal's political transformation is happening in the context of a broader democratic recession globally. Freedom House has documented declining democratic freedoms worldwide for 18 consecutive years. In that context, Nepal's election is remarkable. Here is a country where the democratic process actually worked. Voters were unhappy, they organized, they protested, and then they voted, and the system responded. The old guard lost, and they appear to be accepting the results. That is not nothing. In a world where democratic backsliding is the norm, Nepal just demonstrated that democratic renewal is still possible.
That's a crucial observation, Maya, and it connects to something I think our audience needs to hear. The narrative around democracy in the 21st century has been overwhelmingly pessimistic. We hear about authoritarianism on the rise, about polarization and dysfunction, about voters losing faith in democratic institutions. And much of that narrative is accurate. But Nepal's election is a counter-narrative. It shows that when people are given a genuine choice, when new political movements can actually compete, when the electoral infrastructure functions, democracy can still be a vehicle for transformative change.
Now, I want to examine the regional implications because they are significant. Nepal's neighbors are watching this closely. In India, the ruling BJP government under Narendra Modi has traditionally maintained close relationships with Nepal's established political parties, particularly the Nepali Congress. A new, unpredictable government in Kathmandu represents an unknown variable for New Delhi. On the other side, Beijing, which has been steadily expanding its influence in Nepal through infrastructure investment and diplomatic engagement, will be assessing whether the new government represents an opportunity or a challenge for Chinese strategic interests in South Asia.
And there's a dimension here that relates directly to climate, which is our beat on this show. Nepal is one of the most climate-vulnerable nations on Earth. The Himalayan glaciers are melting at an accelerating rate, threatening the water supply for hundreds of millions of people downstream. Nepal has experienced devastating floods, landslides, and changing agricultural patterns directly attributable to climate change. The country contributes virtually nothing to global carbon emissions, yet it bears a disproportionate burden of the consequences. Any new government in Kathmandu must grapple with climate adaptation, disaster preparedness, and the fundamental injustice of climate vulnerability falling on the nations least responsible for causing it.
That's an essential point. The Himalayan region is sometimes called the third pole because of its massive ice reserves. According to the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, glaciers in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region could lose up to 80% of their volume by the end of this century under high-emission scenarios. Nepal sits right at the epicenter of that crisis. The rivers fed by those glaciers, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Indus system, provide water to nearly 2 billion people. What happens in Nepal's mountains is not a local story. It is a global story with civilizational implications.
And this is where governance matters enormously. Nepal needs massive investment in climate adaptation infrastructure, early warning systems for floods and landslides, climate-resilient agriculture, and renewable energy development. The country has enormous hydroelectric potential that remains largely untapped due to corruption, bureaucratic dysfunction, and political instability. If the RSP government can actually deliver on clean energy development, it could transform Nepal's economy while addressing climate resilience simultaneously. That is the kind of governance outcome that would make this election truly historic.
Let's also talk about the social dimensions of this political shift. Nepal is an incredibly diverse country, with over 120 ethnic groups and more than 120 languages spoken. The country's caste system, while legally abolished, continues to shape social and economic hierarchies. The old political parties often exploited ethnic and caste divisions for electoral advantage. The RSP's cross-cutting appeal, winning seats across geographic and ethnic lines, suggests that voters may be moving beyond identity-based politics toward issue-based politics. That would be a significant democratic maturation.
But we should be cautious about over-romanticizing this moment. Political movements that promise to transcend old divisions can sometimes paper over real grievances that need to be addressed. Indigenous and marginalized communities in Nepal, including Dalits, Janajatis, and Medhisis, have fought hard for recognition and representation. The new government must not treat inclusion as an afterthought. The constitutional provisions guaranteeing proportional representation for marginalized groups exist for a reason, and the RSP will be judged on whether they honor those commitments or treat them as obstacles to their agenda.
That's a vital check on the narrative, Alex. And it connects to the broader question of what kind of democracy Nepal is building. Is it a democracy that simply replaces one set of elites with another? Or is it a democracy that genuinely distributes power, creates accountability mechanisms, and gives voice to the most marginalized? The answer to that question will determine whether this election is remembered as a turning point or just another chapter in the cycle of raised hopes and broken promises that has characterized Nepali politics for too long.
Now let's zoom out and connect this story to global patterns, because I think there are lessons here that extend far beyond Nepal's borders. Around the world, we are seeing a generational shift in politics. From the climate strikes led by young activists in Europe, to the pro-democracy movements in Southeast Asia, to the social justice movements in the Americas and Africa, young people are demanding a different kind of politics. They are less loyal to established parties, more skeptical of traditional institutions, and more willing to take to the streets. Nepal shows what happens when that energy gets channeled into the electoral process.
And here's the pattern I want to highlight for our viewers. The political establishments that are being challenged share common characteristics regardless of geography. They are characterized by corruption, by an inability or unwillingness to address the climate crisis, by growing inequality, and by a fundamental disconnect between the political class and the lived experience of ordinary citizens. When young people look at the establishment and see leaders who have enriched themselves while failing to provide basic services, clean water, reliable electricity, decent healthcare, affordable education, they are not being naive or idealistic when they demand change. They are being rational.
And the response of the establishment to these demands is also remarkably consistent. First, they ignore the protests. Then they try to suppress them. Then they try to co-opt them. And when all of that fails, they try to undermine the new movements through legal challenges, media attacks, and institutional obstruction. We have seen every one of these tactics deployed in Nepal, and yet the RSP still won. The scale of their victory, 117 seats and counting, suggests that the establishment's playbook is failing, at least in this instance.
Let me raise another dimension that I think is underexplored. The role of social media and digital organizing in this political transformation is significant. Lamekane built his initial following through media, and the RSP leveraged digital platforms for organizing and communication in ways that the old parties, with their reliance on patronage networks and local power brokers, could not match. This is part of a global trend where digital tools are enabling new forms of political organization that can bypass traditional gatekeepers. But it also raises questions about the durability and depth of digitally mediated political movements.
That's a smart observation. Digital organizing is powerful for mobilization, but governance requires sustained institutional capacity that social media followings cannot provide. The RSP will need to build a party infrastructure that can translate electoral support into effective governance, and that means developing local party organizations, training cadres, establishing policy development capacity, and creating the kind of institutional depth that the old parties built over decades. Doing all of that while simultaneously running a government is an enormous challenge.
Let's also consider the economic dimensions in more detail, because the climate implications are directly tied to economic policy. Nepal's hydroelectric potential is estimated at over 80,000 megawatts, but only about 2,000 megawatts have been developed. That is a staggering gap. The reasons for this underperformance are overwhelmingly political: corruption in contracting, disputes over licensing, inadequate transmission infrastructure, and the inability of successive governments to create a stable regulatory environment for investment. If the RSP government can unlock even a fraction of Nepal's hydroelectric potential, it would represent both an economic transformation and a massive contribution to clean energy in the region.
And here's the climate connection that I think is most important. Nepal could be exporting clean electricity to India, one of the world's largest carbon emitters. India is desperately trying to expand its electricity generation to meet growing demand, and much of that new capacity is coming from coal. If Nepal can develop its hydroelectric resources and build the transmission infrastructure to export that clean power, it could displace coal generation in India while generating revenue for Nepal. That is the kind of win-win solution that the climate crisis demands, but it requires competent, corruption-free governance to execute.
The outgoing political establishment failed to deliver on hydroelectric development for decades, and the reason is not complicated. Corruption. Contracts were awarded based on political connections rather than technical competence. Licensing fees were siphoned off. Environmental impact assessments were either ignored or manipulated. And the communities affected by dam construction, often indigenous and marginalized people, were displaced without adequate compensation. The new government has an opportunity to do this differently, but only if they break decisively from the corrupt practices that have characterized Nepal's energy sector.
Now, I want to address something that international observers are watching closely, which is the stability question. Nepal has had frequent government changes, with prime ministers coming and going at a dizzying pace. The country has had over 30 governments since the restoration of democracy in 1990. Coalition politics, party switching, and no-confidence motions have created chronic instability that has undermined governance and deterred investment. The RSP's potential supermajority could change this dynamic by providing the parliamentary strength to govern without relying on coalition partners who can pull the rug out at any moment.
That's a double-edged sword, though, Alex. A strong majority provides stability, but it also means less parliamentary check on the government's power. Healthy democracies require a robust opposition that can hold the government accountable, scrutinize legislation, and represent the interests of those who voted differently. If the old parties have been reduced to a rump opposition, the question becomes whether Nepal's other democratic institutions, the judiciary, the media, civil society, are strong enough to provide the accountability that a weak parliamentary opposition cannot.
And this brings us to the broader synthesis of what we're seeing here. Nepal's election is a case study in democratic disruption. A young population, frustrated by decades of misgovernance and corruption, has used the democratic process to sweep away the old order and install an entirely new political movement. The climate implications are enormous, because Nepal sits at the intersection of glacial melt, extreme weather vulnerability, and untapped clean energy potential. How the new government handles these interlinked challenges will have consequences far beyond Nepal's borders.
The pattern I see, and I think it's the most important takeaway for our viewers, is that democratic renewal and climate action are deeply interconnected. The political establishments that have failed on governance have also failed on climate. They have failed because the same corruption, the same short-termism, the same capture by vested interests that produces bad governance also produces climate inaction. When citizens demand accountability and transparency, they are simultaneously demanding better climate policy, even when climate is not explicitly on the ballot.
And Nepal illustrates this perfectly. The country's climate vulnerability is a direct consequence of governance failure. Early warning systems that could save lives during floods and landslides have not been built because funds were diverted. Hydroelectric projects that could provide clean energy have stalled because of corruption. Climate adaptation measures for agriculture have not been implemented because the bureaucracy is dysfunctional. A government that actually governs competently would, by definition, be a government that addresses climate vulnerability, because climate resilience is simply good governance in a warming world.
I also want to connect this to the broader South Asian context. The entire region, from Pakistan to Bangladesh to Sri Lanka to India, is experiencing the convergence of democratic crisis and climate crisis. Pakistan had devastating floods in 2022 that displaced 33 million people and caused over $30 billion in damage. Sri Lanka experienced economic collapse linked partly to agricultural policy failures. Bangladesh faces existential threats from sea level rise. India is experiencing increasingly severe heat waves and water stress. Nepal's political transformation is happening in a region where the stakes of governance failure are measured in human lives and civilizational survival.
And that's why this story matters so much, Maya. This is not just a feel-good story about a rapper becoming prime minister. This is a story about whether democratic systems can respond to the existential challenges of our time. Can a new government, born from popular frustration, actually build the institutions needed to protect 30 million people from climate catastrophe? Can they develop clean energy resources that could benefit hundreds of millions in the region? Can they prove that democratic renewal leads to better outcomes, not just better rhetoric?
Those are the questions we'll be tracking in the months and years ahead. And I want to emphasize something for our audience. The outcome is not predetermined. Political revolutions have a mixed track record. Some deliver transformative change. Others collapse under the weight of unrealistic expectations, institutional resistance, and the sheer difficulty of governing. Nepal's new leadership will face all of these challenges simultaneously, while also navigating the geopolitical complexities of their neighborhood and the accelerating impacts of climate change on one of the most vulnerable landscapes on Earth.
Let me add one more layer to this analysis. The international community has a role to play here as well. Nepal is one of the world's least developed countries, and it cannot address its climate vulnerability alone. The promises made by wealthy nations at successive climate summits to provide adaptation financing to vulnerable countries have been consistently broken. Nepal deserves not just congratulations for its democratic achievement but concrete support, financial, technical, and diplomatic, to help the new government build climate resilience. Anything less is hypocrisy from nations that caused the climate crisis and now watch its consequences unfold in the Himalayas.
That's a critical point, and it connects to the fundamental injustice at the heart of the climate crisis. Countries like Nepal that have contributed almost nothing to greenhouse gas emissions are paying the highest price. The melting glaciers above Kathmandu were not melted by Nepali emissions. They were melted by decades of industrialization in North America, Europe, and increasingly China and India. Climate justice demands that those who caused the problem fund the solutions for those who are suffering the consequences. Nepal's new government should be demanding that funding aggressively, and the international community should be providing it without conditions or bureaucratic obstacles.
As we wrap up tonight's coverage, I want to come back to the human dimension of this story. Behind the election statistics and geopolitical analysis are 30 million people who are hoping that this time, things will be different. Young Nepalis who protested in the streets, who voted for the first time, who dared to believe that their voice could matter, they have delivered their verdict. Now comes the hard part. Governing a complex, diverse, climate-vulnerable nation in one of the most geopolitically sensitive neighborhoods on Earth. We wish them well, and we will hold them accountable.
And that's the job of journalism, Alex. We celebrate democratic achievement, but we don't stop asking questions. We'll be watching whether the RSP delivers on its promises. We'll be tracking whether corruption actually decreases. We'll be monitoring whether climate adaptation measures get implemented. We'll be examining whether marginalized communities are included in the new political dispensation. Democracy doesn't end at the ballot box. It begins there.
To our viewers, this story matters because what happens in Nepal doesn't stay in Nepal. The glaciers that are melting feed rivers that sustain nearly 2 billion people. The political precedent being set will echo across South Asia and beyond. The clean energy potential that could be unlocked would have regional climate implications. And the democratic experiment now underway will either inspire or caution movements for change around the world.
So stay informed, stay engaged, and remember that the most powerful force in any democracy is an informed citizenry that demands accountability. The people of Nepal have shown us what that looks like. The question now is whether their leaders will rise to meet the moment.
That's all for tonight's Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and we'll see you next time.